Well, good morning. How y'all doing today? Good. All right, you guys are way more awake than our Greensboro campus, but it was still kind of early there, right? And you've had time to let the caffeine begin soaking in. Hey, I want to say a special welcome to those of you watching online. We're so glad you can be a part of our church family virtually, and we hope that when you feel safe coming back, you'll do so, because as much as you get to see us every week, we don't get to see you, and we would love to see your smiling faces here as a part of our church. My name's Seth, in case we haven't had the opportunity to meet, and again, so glad to have you here with us today. Now, we've been saying for the last several weeks, when life gives you lemons, you do what? You make lemonade. Your welcome was more like exciting than that, right? I mean, you know that, and I'd like to think it's from, paying attention over the last 4 weeks, but you just know that. That's just kind of built in. We all know that's what you do when life gives you lemons. But sometimes, I don't know if you've felt this before, sometimes you don't really want to make lemonade with the lemons that are given to you. Sometimes you want to throw the lemons back at other people. And there was a meme being sent around our church staff yesterday in relation to this whole concept. But, there was one of those times for me when I was I was actually a freshman in high school. It had to do with my 8th grade math teacher. And I don't remember exactly, why I didn't like him so much, but I remember some of the reasons. And I felt devalued by him. I'd be sitting in the back of class with my hand up, never call on me. Then I'd put my hand under my arm to hold it up, that thing, and never call on me. But then when the football players would raise their hands, because clearly I'm not a football player, but when they would raise their hands, he'd call on them, instantly. And it just felt like I was a nobody in the class. And so I think there was some pent up, frustration with that. And I don't know that it was intentional, right? I mean, he probably didn't even know he was doing it, right? So give him the benefit of the doubt. But one day when I was a freshman in high school, I had to do what high school students dread doing, which is ride the bus home. And so I was a freshman in high school, and our middle school, high school were next to each other. I had to walk down to the middle school, get on the bus, wait for the middle schoolers to get on. And I'm sitting at the back of the bus, and I see this teacher come out because he was on bus duty. And I thought, there's my opportunity, right, to hurl some lemons. So as soon as he turned his head around, I yelled something out the window at him. Now, it wasn't profane, it was just totally immature. Now, keep in mind, I'm a 9th grader, so what was that, 14 years old, just immature high school student, and, I had the opportunity to throw my lemons at him, and that's exactly what I did because of the lemons I felt he had given to me. Now, throughout this series, we've been talking about lemons in life, and I'll tell you the rest of that story because it's kind of funny. I'll tell you the rest of that in a little bit. But what we've been talking about is the lemons that we all get in life, and we said this, that life gives everyone lemons, but life doesn't give lemons out evenly. Right? Sometimes some of us get more lemons than others, and we've been studying the life of a person named Joseph from Jewish antiquity, and Joseph had more lemons than you and I can probably even imagine. And in case you didn't know this, there are 2 Josephs in the Bible. One was married to Mary, Jesus' earthly parents, and then there's this other Joseph whose life is recorded in the book of Genesis. It's actually the longest narrative we have in the book of Genesis. It's a remarkable story. And if you haven't been with us, I'd encourage you to read it on your own. You can pick up at Genesis 37. I'm not going to go through all of it today, but you can also catch up online at iCommunityChurch.com. And we've been talking about and tracking with Joseph's life and seeing the lessons that, we can draw from the things that God was teaching him as he faced all kinds of unimaginable lemons in life. Now, with that statement, when life gives you lemons, there's an implication, and the implication is in the word when. The implication is that life will eventually give you lemons, right? It's not if life gives you lemons, make lemonade. It's when life gives you lemons. And so because of that, sometimes it's life that gives you lemons, and sometimes the lemon giver has a name. I don't know if you've ever thought about that before, but sometimes it's not the universe being against you, or it's not, the evil in the world, or it's not, God even. Sometimes there's actually a person, and that person has a name, like my 8th grade math teacher, or like your mom, or your dad, or, your in-laws, or maybe it was a former friend, or maybe it was a sibling, or maybe it was a coach, or somebody, who was on the team. I mean, there are different times in life where there's somebody who kind of delivers lemons to us. And so the thing we want to talk about today, and really the question I want to encourage you and invite you to wrestle with, is that what do you do when someone else is responsible for giving you the lemons? What do you do when someone else is responsible for giving you the lemons? And we have a phrase in our culture, right? Don't get mad, get even. Even, there you go. We have another one about payback, but I won't have you fill in the blank on that one because it wouldn't be appropriate for church. But in our culture, we have this idea that you don't just have to take the lemons that people give to us, right? You can throw them back. And sometimes, and you may not be somebody who necessarily throws them back, but sometimes we keep lists. We keep a list of the lemon givers. In fact, you may have a list. There could be in your mind as we're talking about this, different things. And you've kind of got a sack of lemons. And in that sack of lemons, you've got some people like your ex and the resentment that you feel toward what your ex did, and you've kind of carried that around in your little sack of lemons. Or maybe there's your stepmom and the mistrust that was created because of the way your stepmom dealt with you. Or maybe there's your in-laws, and they've affected your self-image in a significant way, and you just feel bitter and angry toward your in-laws. Or maybe it's your dad who didn't show up, and he should have been there, but he wasn't. And so because of that, there's abandonment, and you just feel so frustrated about that. Maybe it's a friend, and they led you to some kind of addiction, got addiction on the back of that one. I mean, there are all kinds of lemons that we get in life, and our temptation with the lemons is to want to hurl them at people. Good catch. Making sure you're awake. Sorry, didn't mean to surprise you with that. But our temptation is to take the lemons that we have, and throw them at other people, because we're so frustrated with what they've done. Now, what's interesting is sometimes the lemons other people give us are intentional, and sometimes I have to believe they're totally unintentional. I think sometimes you make a statement and you don't even realize that you hurled a lemon at somebody else, but it was received in such a bitter and sour way that there are times when we don't even know. But the question I want to ask you right now is, how long have you been holding on to lemons that were given to you by someone else? When you think about kind of your lemon list, whether it was from a year ago or 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 50 years ago, how long have you been holding on to the sourness that was thrown at you by someone else? And if you could get the opportunity, what would you do? Would you hurl them back? Sometimes we imagine the conversations we're going to have with somebody when we get the chance. We power up and think, this is what I'm going to say. It's the perfect zinger. I don't know if you've ever thought about this before. I was thinking about it in relation to this. What is it in us that wants to hurt people who have hurt us? It's actually kind of a sick and sadistic thing when you really think about it, because it says, you've inflicted pain on me, you've made my life sour, so I'm going to do what I can to get you back. And it's not even about getting even anymore. It's actually about being more even, right? I want to punish you for what you've done to me. That's why our culture has this whole concept of karma, right? What goes around comes around, and you deserve it. I mean, this is what you get for what you have done. We want to see people suffer for the evil that they've done, or we want to see people get the good that they have supposedly done. The problem is, and I don't know if you've ever thought about this before, and I promise we're going to get to the story of Joseph here in just a minute. The problem is this: how can someone actually pay for the lemons they've given us? Have you ever thought about that? I mean, the irony is that we hold on to these lemons from the past, they control us in the future, and we want them to pay for it, but how can they ever actually pay? I mean, imagine your lemon was an absent father, and he should have been there. You needed a role model, you needed somebody to build you up, you needed somebody to be involved in your life, but he wasn't. And so now, 30 years later, or 40 years later, whatever it is, I mean, how could you ever make him pay back that? How could you go back and relive those years? They're gone. You can't. Or maybe it's a relationship, and you put everything you had into it, and you were trying, and you got rejected, and you got papers delivered to you, and it came to an end, and now they're an ex. How can you ever make them pay back what they've taken from you? It is impossible. And yet what we so often do is carry the hurt that they've inflicted on us into the future, into our present, because we want them to pay back what they have done that they can never actually pay back. And here's the problem, and this is kind of where we're going today, that adding more lemons to lemons will not make sweet lemonade. Adding more lemons to the lemons that we get in life, because you can make lemonade with just water and lemons, it's going to be pretty sour. And adding more lemons to that will not sweeten things up. It only leads you in a path that is not a good direction for your life. Now, one last thing before we get into the story of Joseph. There are times in life where the lemons that we have were delivered to us by the person we see when we look in the mirror. Because there are times in life where we make decisions and our decisions carry consequences that we have no idea about. We have no idea how we said, is going to impact things. We have no idea how what we did is going to impact things. And it's years and years and years later that we finally begin to understand how it all unfolded. And there are times in our lives where we can't go back and redo. But we have an opportunity in those moments to respond differently. In the story of Joseph, it's his brothers. They responded to lemons with more lemons. And they ended up suffering significantly because of it. In fact, I think they suffered about 20 years because of it, maybe even more. And as a result, their lives didn't get sweeter. It headed them down a trajectory that would not be ultimately good for them. Now, to catch you up just a little bit on the story of Joseph, in case you're not as familiar with it, Joseph was one of 12 sons. He was number 11 out of 12 of a man named Jacob, who would later be named Israel. And so Jacob had these 12 sons. Joseph was the favorite son because he came from Jacob's favorite wife. And as a result, the older brothers, they hated him. The father gave him special treatment. He gave him a special ornamented robe that just made them hate him more. Until one day they hated him so much, they decided that they would sell him into slavery. And so Joseph was sold into slavery where he was a slave for we don't know exactly how many years. Eventually he was thrown into prison for some false accusations against him. And then where we left the story off last week, Joseph was brought before Pharaoh to interpret some of Pharaoh's dreams. And the dream that Joseph interpreted was that there would be 7 years of plenty and then there would be 7 years of famine. 7 years of just this bumper crop, and then 7 years where people would wonder, where is God? What is happening to us? There is no food to be had. And so Joseph was put in charge of caring for the resources, storing up the resources for the land of Egypt, and ultimately for other countries, as we're about to see. And so that's kind of where we left things off. There was a ton of crops that were brought in. Here's what Genesis chapter 41, verse 49 tells us, that Joseph stored up huge quantities of grain, like the sand of the sea. That's how much there was. It was so much that he stopped keeping records because it was beyond all measure. I mean, you just imagine there were storehouses in every city. Joseph was overseeing it, and it got so much they couldn't even keep track of it anymore. And during this time, Joseph got married, he became a father, he had 2 sons, and here's what the text tells us about his sons. Joseph named his firstborn Manasseh, which means the Lord has made me forget, and said it is because God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household. Think about that. God has made me forget. The second son he named Ephraim, and said, it's because God has made me fruitful, because the name Ephraim means twice fruitful, in the land of my suffering. Now, right here in these verses, because throughout the rest of the story leading up to this point in time, we don't really know how Joseph is responding to everything that's taking place around him. We don't get any indication of what he's feeling, what he's going through, but these verses right here give us a beautiful picture. There has been trouble, there has been suffering. There have been lemons delivered to me, and yet God has made me forget. Somehow God dealt with me. Somehow God worked in me. Now, I have to imagine, Joseph, we know, was in prison for at least 2 years of his life. It was 13 years from the time he was sold in slavery till the time he made it into Pharaoh's, council and was able to become the second in command in the land of Egypt. So we know that there was a long period of time. How many nights he was in prison, I don't know. How many times did he lie awake at night thinking about the lemons that had been hurled at him by other people? How many times did he cry out to God because of his suffering? And yet his relationship with God is so important here. In fact, it says, God has made me forget, Joseph said. God has made me forget all my trouble. God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering. And it didn't happen overnight. This was 20 years later that Joseph got to the point of saying, God is doing something good here. Now, there came about a famine in the land, and just as Joseph had predicted, as he interpreted Pharaoh's dreams through God's strength, And here's what the text says, that when Jacob, that's Joseph's father, to recall, when Jacob learned that there was grain in Egypt, he said to his sons, "Why do you just keep looking at each other? You lazy bums." Now, I think this verse is so funny because, Jacob at this point in time was probably over 100 years old. He's talking to his adult children, and he looks at them and says, "You morons, why do you just keep looking at each other?" Now, keep in mind, the brothers sold Joseph into slavery because their dad wasn't giving them the attention they wanted. What do you think happened as a result? I don't think things were resolved in any significant ways, treating them like children. He continued, here's what the text says. He continued, "I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us so that we may live and not die. Don't you care about us not dying? Don't you want to step in and do something? So why don't you saddle up your camels, or as we're going to see later, donkeys, and get on the road and go get us some grain." So then the text continues, 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain from Egypt. But Jacob did not send Benjamin, Joseph's brother. Now, Benjamin was the only full-blooded brother with Joseph. He came also from the favorite wife. And so as a result, the father, Jacob, he held Benjamin back because he was afraid that harm might come to him. He didn't care about harm coming to the other 10. He just cared about harm coming to his favorite child. Not much has changed back at the homestead, has it? I mean, it's kind of the same old, same old. 20 years later, nothing is different. The brothers hurled their lemons at Joseph, and it didn't solve their problem. So they go on the road. Israel's sons, the text says, were among those who went to buy grain, because many people from the surrounding territories went to buy grain, for there was a famine in the land of Canaan also. So keep in mind, up to this point in time, Joseph's been meeting with people. He was responsible for both the collection and the distribution of grain. He's meeting with people day in and day out for weeks on end. And then suddenly this caravan of guys, 10 guys, who are dressed a little bit differently, probably looking a little bit like country bumpkins, they show up in the land of Egypt, show up right before Joseph. And the text says this, "Now Joseph was the governor of the land, the person who sold grain to all his people. So when Joseph's brothers arrived, they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground." But they had no idea who they're bowing down to. They just think they're bowing down to the person who's in charge here. They know that they're coming begging for some food because their families are starving. And in this moment, if you recall from the first week, if you've been a part of this series with us, or if you just know the story, Joseph had these dreams about these sheaves of wheat bowing down to his sheaf of wheat, that his brothers would be bowing down at some point to him. And now in these moments, it's all coming true. I mean, all the prophecy that he had dreamed about is becoming reality. And as soon as Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them. Now, this is 20 years later. He's probably 37 years old. He spent more time away from his family than he did with his family. And yet there's something about their voices, there's something about their appearance that he knows undeniably who these guys are. But he pretended to be a stranger and spoke harshly to them. Now, I can't imagine. You think about all the days Joseph was enslaved, all the days Joseph was in prison, how many nights he heard their voices ringing in his head. Sell him, don't kill him, sell him, throw him in the pit, do something with him. I mean, how often did he replay what was taking place and what had happened to him, the pain that had been inflicted upon him, the lemons that had been delivered to him in his life. 20 years is a long time. It's a long time to hold on to lemons. Some of you, it's possible you've been holding on to lemons for more than 20 years. His brothers were at the same time holding on to their self-inflicted lemons for 20 years. As in these moments, things began to fall apart for them. But the thing we learned through all of this is that what we do with our lemons makes all the difference. I mean, really, this is the moment Joseph had to get even. They were in the palm of his hand. And he could have sat them down and started laughing and said, you have no idea who you're bowing down to. And why don't you take a seat, and then I'll pull your fingernails out, and then we'll have a talk about everything that you did to me and the pain you inflicted on me and the years I was enslaved and then the false accusations and how I spent years in prison. Let's talk about that, guys, and let's inflict this pain on your families. He could have done that. And honestly, many of us probably would do that if we had the opportunity, if the tables were turned and suddenly we're in charge and we're in control of the situation. But what you do with your lemons makes all the difference. It's his chance to get even, just like it was my chance to get even with my math teacher, just like it might be your chance to get even when you're ex and you cross paths, or your dad who's been estranged, or your prodigal child who disappeared years ago, and they have caused all kinds of pain and frustration. Then they show up and act like nothing has happened. That's what we're dealing with here. But let me ask you the question, because I have to believe this was part of Joseph's story. What would it have solved? What would it have accomplished if Joseph just took his sack of lemons and beat his family with them? What would it have solved, honestly? How could he ever get them to repay what they took from him? The years of suffering that he went through, how could they ever pay those back? They couldn't. And frankly, there would have been a lot of innocent bystanders who were hurt in the process, because they had families, his siblings had families. I mean, if he executed them or threw them in prison for the rest of their lives, they had families. It was his father back home. I mean, there were all kinds of things that would have come into play. And so Joseph, I believe, because God had helped him, God had healed him, God had enabled him to name his children Manasseh. God has helped me forget. Ephraim, God has made me fruitful. In the land of my suffering, there has been healing. But I think Joseph spoke harshly to them, one, because he wanted to get information out of them, and two, because he wanted to test them, and he wanted to see where they were, what God had done in their lives. So here's what the text continues to say. Where do you come from? He asked. From the land of Canaan. They replied, to buy food. The text continues, although Joseph recognized his brothers, they did not recognize him. And then he remembered his dreams about them and said to them, you are spies. You have come to see where our land is unprotected. Now they had mocked Joseph for his dreams that are obviously now coming true. They had no idea, but he had some idea. They're terrified. I mean, imagine being interrogated by the person who's in charge of your life at this point in time, being accused of being spies. But they answered, no, my lord. Your servants have come to buy food. We don't even want a handout. We'll pay for it. We come to buy food. We are the sons of one man. Your servants are honest men, though they weren't, because they lied to their father about what happened to Joseph. Your servants are honest men, not spies. No, he said to them, you have come to see where our land is unprotected. Continuing on, he said, but they replied, your servants were 12 brothers, the son of one man who lives in the land of Canaan. The youngest is now with our father, and one is no more. Imagine being Joseph hearing that. I'm dead to them. They think I'm dead. So Joseph said to them, it's just as I told you, you are spies, and this is how you will be tested. Here's why I want to make sure you're telling the truth. As surely as Pharaoh lives, you will not leave this place unless your youngest brother comes here. I think Joseph wanted to see his brother. And so he threw him into prison, and he said, one of you is going to be allowed to go free. And imagine what these guys are thinking about in those 3 days in prison. We have an idea of what they were thinking about. They were thinking about what they had done to their brother 20 years before. They were thinking about the pain they had inflicted on him and the lemons they had thrown at his life. So 3 days later, Joseph calls them back. He changes his mind. One of them has to stay. He wants a down payment, a deposit. The other ones are allowed to go and retrieve their brother. And so all of a sudden, the brothers, they kind of begin talking, and here's what they say. They said to one another, surely we are being punished. We're being punished because of our brother. We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded with us for his life. Just think about how many nights did they lie awake in bed hearing the voice of Joseph. Guys, what are you doing? Guys, don't throw me in the pit. Please, guys, help me. Let me get out. Help me out. Guys, don't sell me into slavery. Please, please, what are you doing? Guys, please. What did they hear over and over and over again as he pleaded with us for his life? but we would not listen. And their conclusion is that's why this distress has come on us. Throwing lemons at their lemons did not, and it will not, solve your problems. So Joseph, he was present as they're arguing amongst themselves. I can only imagine what that was like. The text says they did not realize that Joseph could understand them since he was speaking through an interpreter. And so continuing on, he turned away from them and began to weep. It's like the emotion, the reliving of the experience. It was just too much. So he turned away, began to weep, but then came back and spoke to them again. He had Simeon taken from them and bound before their eyes. And then Joseph did something that I think is so remarkable. I think it is a reflection of the work God had done in his life up to this point in time. Because he could have again inflicted lemons on lemons, but he didn't. Here's what the text says. Joseph gave orders to fill their bags with grain, to put each man's silver back in his sack, and to give them provisions for their journey. We're going to give them what they came for, which was the grain. We're not even going to make them pay for it. We're going to give them money back. And I'm going to give them food for their journey. I'm going to watch out for them. I'm going to give them the very thing that they did not give to me, the care that I deserved. After this was done for them, they loaded their grain on their donkeys and left. Think about the kindness that Joseph showed when people had only given him lemons. Fill their bags, put each man's silver back, give them provisions. Now, as the brothers left, they had to stop somewhere for the night, and they opened their sacks, and they realized the silver was back in their sacks, and they had no idea Joseph had put it in there. And they saw this as an omen. I mean, they started kind of freaking out. Here's what it says. Their hearts sank, and they turned to each other trembling and said, "What is it that God has done to us?" They saw it as God is doing something to us. They didn't see it as something that God was doing for us, because all they could see was the pain that they had caused and the distress they had created and the payment they were receiving, the natural consequences for their choices. They had no idea that God was doing the very thing that we have been talking about for the last several weeks. He was working all things together for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purposes, that he was using Joseph to bring healing and restoration to this incredibly broken family. That God was not doing anything to them. God was actually doing something for them, which Joseph was able to see when he says, look, I'm going to name my child Ephraim, which means fruitful. That God has actually blessed me in the midst of everything that I've been going through. Now, we're going to kind of stop the story here for today, and we're going to pick up the rest of it next week. You're not going to want to miss that. But before we go, in case this wasn't clear, it probably was already, but I'll just state it again really clearly. Revenge is never sweet. Revenge is never sweet. I mean, we're taught that revenge is so sweet and it's going to be great, and that's what we need to do is get revenge, get payback. But it never turns out the way we hope it will. But you know what revenge does do? It makes you sour. Revenge is never sweet, but it does make you sour. And it ruins relationships, and it hurts your future, and you carry it with you into the future. There are things from our past that we carry with us, and they were so hurtful, and because we're holding on to them, it has only enabled us and caused us to be sour right here in the present. The way we move beyond that is doing what Joseph did. Because we can never get even. We can never get even. Even isn't even a possibility. But we make sweet lemonade by forgiving, by giving grace. That's kindness that's not deserved. In fact, the Apostle Paul, years later, thousands of years later, he would write this in a church to Ephesus. He says, but because of his great love for us, God, but because of his great love for us, because God loves you so much. I'm telling you, the concept that God loves you, that is a uniquely Christian concept. That comes from Jesus. That comes from the Apostle John, who said, I've looked love in the eyes, and God is love. I know God is love. He says, because of his great love for us, God, who is rich in mercy, not money, mercy. He's got a whole bunch of it. He is rich in mercy. He made us alive with Christ even when we were dead in transgressions. Now, transgressions is kind of a churchy word, but it just means that you've broken a law. In this case, we've broken God's law. But that because we have gone against what God wanted for us, we stand dead before him. But because of Christ, we're found alive. And then he goes on, he says, for it is by grace. It is by grace, God's kindness. It is by God's kindness in sending Jesus to us, the kind of grace that Joseph showed his brothers when he filled their sacks with grain, when he returned their money, when he gave them provisions for the journey. That's the kind of grace, God's kindness that you have been saved. It is nothing other than his kindness that you have been saved. And then he goes on, he says, through faith. That is confidence in what Jesus has done for us. Hope for something that we can't yet see and cling to, but believing that we already have it. You know, the whole concept of through faith. You got in this room, or for those of you watching online, you got in your room somehow, probably through a door. And what Paul was saying is that the way we enter into this place of grace and receiving kindness is through Jesus. Through faith, confidence in him. And then he goes on, he says, and this not from yourselves, it is the gift of God, not by works so that no one can boast. Nobody can brag about it. We all get in the same way. None of us is better than anyone else. It is the most even, equal way, and it is through God's grace. It is a gift. No one can claim, I deserve it more than you, because none of us deserve it. My guess is you've thrown some lemons in your life. I certainly have. It's only by God's grace that you and I move forward anyway. And it is only by God's grace that we can bring healing to the lemons that we've received. Jesus was asked the question, how many times do I have to forgive somebody, Jesus? He answered 70 times 7, which was meant to really mean there's no point where you stop forgiving, because refusing to forgive will only make you sour. Forgiveness is the sweetness that you add to lemonade. It's the sugar that turns our lemons into lemonade, a sweet lemonade. So back to my story from 8th grade, or 9th grade rather, my 8th grade math teacher. So I yelled, what I yelled out the window of the bus, and the teacher turned around and he headed to the bus. And then he got on the bus. Then he started walking to the back of the bus. And then he started looking at me. And then he said to me, did you yell that? And I would imagine my eyes got big and I was feeling kind of sheepish. And I said, yes. And he looked at me and he said, I thought it was you. And then he turned around and he went off the bus. It was the weirdest thing. And I had thrown my lemons back, but I didn't feel good about it. I got away with it, and there was something in me that it was not what I wanted. Because again, how can somebody ever pay back for a year of my life that I felt they stole? How? So I went home that night, and I wrote a letter to him, and I explained about my 8th grade experience, and then I apologized and told him I was wrong, and I asked him to forgive me. And I mailed the letter to him. And it was a couple weeks later, I think. I don't honestly remember. To the best of my recollection, it was a little while later. I was walking around the middle school for some extracurricular activity, and he found me and thanked me for the letter, and that was that. And quite honestly, I hadn't even thought about this. If you were to ask me about my 8th grade year, I wouldn't even bring up math class. I would talk about my science class and the fun we had with Bunsen burners, because Bunsen burners are fun, right? I mean, mixing chemicals, and that was my favorite part of 8th grade. And it was only in looking through some old notes and a message I delivered to students years and years and years ago that I saw this story like, wait a minute, oh yeah, but I'm telling you, God enabled me to move beyond it. He enabled me to move beyond it, because revenge doesn't make your lemonade more drinkable. It makes it more sour. Revenge doesn't solve anything. So let me ask you a question. Is there someone you need to forgive? There a sack of lemons you've been carrying around with some people's names on it? The way you know it is when I asked you earlier who'd given you lemons, if you had a list of lemons, you probably had somebody come to mind. So many of us do, myself included. There are times where we just hold on to these things. But the way we're going to move beyond it isn't by throwing more lemons. God wants to get you to the point he got Joseph where he could name his children, God's made me forget. God has made me twice fruitful. I mean, he has helped me in the land of my suffering to move beyond, and now I can actually look at it and I can see the good. Now keep in mind, there was nothing good about being sold into slavery. There is nothing good about being rejected and betrayed by your family. And yet Joseph was able to look back at that and say something good has come. And it's what enabled him and allowed him to extend the kindness to his siblings. And I'm telling you, God wants to do the same for you. One of the fears I think we have when it comes to forgiveness is, I'm letting them off the hook, right? I mean, shouldn't they have to pay? Joseph didn't seem to be worried about letting them off the hook. What if they hurt me again? It could. But forgiving somebody else doesn't mean that the relationship goes back to the way it was. It doesn't mean that you have to restore everything that's been broken. It just means that they owed you something that they can never repay, and so you're canceling that debt. So that when they come before you again, you don't hold it against them. You cancel the debt and say, you are forgiven. It's a financial term. It's a financial concept. And it's at that place when we can move to that point where we do receive the ability to move forward, to show grace. And it's because of God's work in us that we're enabled to do that, because that's what he has done for us. I'm telling you, revenge is never sweet. And clinging to your lemons will never make sweet lemonade. Forgiveness, however, is the sugar that turns lemons into sweet lemonade. So in just a second, I want to invite you to close your eyes. Those of you watching online, you can play along too. I want you to close your eyes, and my guess is there's somebody who maybe came to mind who has thrown some lemons at you, and I just want to give you a moment to hold that person before God. And I don't know the depth of what that person has done to you. It may be significant. I'm not trying to minimize any of that. But I'm telling you, inviting God into that hurt space, into the lemons you received, is the first step in bringing healing. And it's because of the grace he's given to us that we're able to do that. So would you just bow your heads, close your eyes, and bring that person who comes to mind before God and invite him into that space. It may mean saying, God, I don't want to forgive. I've been so hurt. It is so hard for me to forgive, and yet I know Christ in me will lead me to that place. God, would you help me? Would you help me to move beyond the sourness I feel in these moments? Would you help me to receive healing? Let me pray for us. Heavenly Father, because I know a room this size and because I know myself, Father, we hold on to the hurts that have been inflicted on us, the lemons that have been given to us. And yet, God, I believe that there is a point of healing that you want to bring us to. Lord, I pray for the lemons that are being brought before you now. I pray for the lemons that will be brought before you in the coming week. I pray, Father, that you would lead us to a place of healing where we could get to the point of saying, the Lord has made me forget. The Lord has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering, that there was some good here that I can't even see in the moment. But I know you've been with me, God. Would you be with us, Father? Would you remind us of your presence? And would you bring us healing and wholeness so that we can be givers of that generous grace that you have given to us? I ask these things in the